In a world where darkness seemed unstoppable, one man's faith defied impossible odds. What miracle could possibly emerge from his unwavering trust in God? Before we begin, if you love exploring God's Word through stories that awaken faith, don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss the next chapter of God's unfolding plan. Journey back with me to ancient Israel, a land that once overflowed with promise but now languished in drought. The people had drifted from their Creator, and the skies withheld rain, not from cruelty, but as a call for his people to turn back. Amidst this judgment, Elijah emerged, not in royal garments, but clothed in unyielding faith, carrying the flame of the living God within. Picture the dry earth, cracked and crumbling underfoot. Once, towns had buzzed with the laughter of harvest and the song of flowing streams. But now, the grass was withered, pools turned to dust, hope itself seemed fragile. We meet Israel in a moment of reckoning. The people, led astray, had chosen to chase after other gods, seeking favor from Baal, the so-called storm god. Yet, their supposed Lord of Rain proved powerless as heaven's gates slammed shut. God's silence thundered louder than any downpour. And so, Elijah stood before Israel's king, Ahab, a leader more interested in appeasing idols than serving the true God. Elijah, alone but never forsaken, declared with holy boldness, "As the Lord, the God of Israel, lives before whom I stand, there shall be neither dew nor rain these years, except by my word." It was not Elijah's arrogance, but his obedience. Imagine one man speaking the words that would shape a nation's destiny. His message was not doom, but invitation. Repent, for the Redeemer still calls. In that moment, Elijah's fate was sealed. As drought deepened, so did opposition. Ahab and Jezebel, his queen, championed false altars and persecuted those loyal to the Lord. Elijah's courage led him not to comfort, but into hiding, sustained only by faith and divine provision. God commanded him, "Depart from here and turn eastward and hide yourself by the brook Chariot, which is east of the Jordan. You shall drink from the brook, and I have commanded the ravens to feed you there." Picture Elijah away from the noise of the kingdom, far from friend and foe. The prophet, brave in public, now humbled in solitude, watched as birds became his providers. Each morning, the ravens brought him bread and meat. Each evening, water from the brook quenched his thirst. It was a season of testing. Would Elijah trust in what he could not see? Would he hold to the promise when provision came in unexpected ways? Through these humble means, God declared, "I am still present, even in drought. I am the source of every need." Through lonely days and silent nights, Elijah's faith was refined. As hunger bit the land, God's hand sustained his servant. Israel's fields lay barren, but on the banks of Chariot, trust grew roots deeper than drought could reach. What must it have been like to rely on ravens, to look each morning and wonder, would the provision come again? But it always did. In this wilderness classroom, Elijah learned that obedience sometimes means stepping into the unknown, believing God's simplest word. Israel's pain was real, but so too was God's mercy gently at work, calling his children to come home. Then, in an act of deeper dependence, God let the brook dry up. Sometimes, the very streams we rely on evaporate. Elijah's shelter faded, and the last drops of water disappeared. What happened now? Would Elijah grow bitter or remain open to the next direction from God? The Lord spoke again, "Arise, go to Zarephath, which belongs to Sidon, and dwell there. Behold, I have commanded a widow there to feed you." The call came not to comfort, but to a foreign land, and to one most unlikely to give aid. Zarephath lay in enemy territory, a region where Baal's worship was strong. Yet, God often chooses the unexpected to reveal his power. As Elijah entered the city, he saw a widow gathering sticks, her poverty more profound than the nation's drought. The Lord's prophet called, "Bring me a little water in a vessel, that I may drink." As she turned to fetch it, he added, Bring me a morsel of bread in your hand." But the widow's heart was burdened. She replied, "As the Lord your God lives, I have nothing baked, only a handful of flour in a jar and a little oil in a jug. Now I'm gathering a couple of sticks that I may go in and prepare it for myself and my son, that we may eat it and die." Hopelessness weighed heavy, but Elijah carried a word stronger than famine. "Do not fear," he told her. "Go and do as you have said, but first make me a little cake and bring it to me, and afterward make something for yourself and your son. For thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, the jar of flour shall not be spent, and the jug of oil shall not be empty, until the day the Lord sends rain upon the earth." Trust often looks foolish amid scarcity, but the widow obeyed. She made bread for Elijah, then for herself and her son. Day by day, her jar never emptied, the jug never ran dry. Each meal was a miracle, a daily testament to the sufficiency of God, carried out in the humblest kitchen by hands marked with both fear and faith. In her poverty, she found abundance. Through her obedience, God provided not just for his prophet, but for her whole household. Elijah stayed in Zarephath, and the household flourished despite the devastation around them. Here, God's pattern unfolds. In the darkest seasons, the Lord seeks surrendered hearts, those willing to trust when situations make no sense. Through Elijah and the widow, we see how faith breaks through famine and trust becomes the seedbed for provision. Their daily bread was evidence, not merely of survival, but of divine relationship. In every lack, God proved himself faithful, but testing was not yet complete. One day, the widow's son fell ill and died. Grief pierced the small home. The widow cried out, "What have you against me, O man of God? Have you come to bring my sin to remembrance and to cause the death of my son?" Listen to that anguish, raw, honest, a prayer wrung from the soul. Elijah himself, overwhelmed, took the boy and stretched himself upon him 3 times, crying to the Lord, "O Lord my God, let this child's life come into him again." Here, both prophet and widow face their greatest trial. Does faith speak even in death's shadow? And God answered. The child's life returned. Joy and awe flooded into their home. While King Ahab lounged in opulence and Jezebel schemed at her chambers, darkness crept into every corner of Israel. The sound of hammers striking gold to shape Baal's image echoed through Samaria's streets, drowning out the distant cries of children grown hungry from famine. The true God had been forgotten, replaced by empty rituals and hollow sacrifices at the hands of a king and queen who cared for power more than the people's spirits. Yet, amidst this gloom, a single figure walked boldly forth, Elijah, the prophet of the Lord. Stepping across marble floors and past sneering guards, he entered the palace not as a subject, but as a messenger. His eyes met the king's with unwavering conviction, his heart aflame not with anger, but with purpose. Elijah spoke not with elaborate orations, nor with flattering speeches, but with the raw edge of truth. "There shall be neither dew nor rain except at my word," he declared, his voice slicing through the air like thunder. This verdict struck terror into the hearts of those who heard, for in a land so dependent on rain, such a judgment meant the difference between life and death. The royal court, accustomed to lies and flattery, could not fathom the courage or the certainty Elijah displayed. In Jezebel's eyes, the prophet was a threat to be eliminated. In Ahab's, he was an annoyance to be ignored or appeased. But Elijah had not come seeking their approval. He came as God's herald, carrying a message that bore the weight of judgment, and, beneath the surface, the promise of mercy. No sooner had Elijah delivered this divine decree than the Lord's voice spoke to him again, not in the courtroom clamor, but in the quietness of his own spirit. "Leave here, turn eastward, and hide in the Koroth ravine, east of the Jordan. You shall drink from the brook, and I have commanded the ravens to supply you with food there." Without question or complaint, Elijah obeyed. As the land withered beneath relentless blue skies, as priests and prophets were hunted and slain by Jezebel's wrath, Elijah found refuge in obscurity. There, beside the gentle waters of Cherith, a new chapter of his journey began, the chapter of trust. Day after day, ravens, the most unlikely of messengers, arrived with bread and meat in their beaks. Each morning and evening, the prophet received his portion, not overflowing, not wanting, just enough. The brook's clear water cooled his thirst. Alone in the wilderness, Elijah discovered the sacredness that can only be found in dependence upon God. He listened to the whisper of the wind, felt the brush of wings as the ravens departed, and allowed his faith to be refined by simplicity and solitude. God's mercy was written in the provision of each day, even as the fields of Israel cracked and split under the weight of God's withheld rain. Yet Elijah's trust was not passive, nor was his obedience born of fear. In the hush of Cherith, Elijah meditated on the very God who controlled the elements, the one who determines the seasons, who forms clouds and commands the rains. Certainly, it would have been tempting for Elijah to question his calling. Why must I hide while the wicked roam free? Why is God silent while Jezebel destroys the prophets of Israel? But the babble of questions faded in the presence of daily miracles. For what seemed like a time of exile was, in truth, a season of preparation. Elijah needed to learn that sustenance does not come from the king's table, nor is protection found within royal walls. Real provision is found in God's creative mercy, a mercy that can send ravens to feed a man and can draw water from a brook in the drought's midst. Elsewhere, the people of Israel searched in vain for answers. Priests multiplied sacrifices on Baal's altars, while Jezebel's henchmen combed the hills for those who refused to bow. As crops shriveled and rivers stilled, desperation took root in Israel's heart. So many had forgotten that every drop of rain, every stalk of wheat, every breath was a gift from the Lord, not from Baal. But Elijah's solitude spoke a silent testimony that in the barrenness of drought, God's abundance can yet be found by those who trust and obey. Even as Elijah dwelled in the ravine, God was at work, transforming him from mere messenger into a man of unwavering faith. The Lord who withheld rain could sustain life by unexpected means. With every meal from the ravens, the lesson deepened. Trust in my provision, even when it defies logic. Rely on my goodness, even when the world collapses. God's faithfulness does not disappear in times of trouble. It shines brightest against the darkness of despair. Silence reigned over Israel. No thunderclouds formed. No dew bathed the grapevines at dawn. Each morning, the sun rose upon scorched earth and anxious hearts. Rumors of drought spread like wildfire. A curse had come upon the land, and with it, the haunting memory of Elijah's words. Still, the prophet remained hidden beside Cherith's dwindling waters, waiting for God's next command, learning the preciousness of obedience. For the same hand that brought bread by raven and water from the brook would surely bring breakthrough in its appointed time. Some might ask, why would God choose ravens, a bird considered unclean by the standards of Israel's law, to feed his cherished prophet? In this detail, we glimpse another layer of God's teaching. God's provisions cannot be confined to our expectations or traditions. He can use what is seen as impure, unworthy, or improbable to reveal his sustaining grace. Elijah's story reminds us the presence and provision of God is not limited by the world's logic. Where hope withers, where evil reigns, God's goodness persists even in the shadows. So, what does this mean for us thousands of years later, living in far different lands? When droughts of the soul come, when hope seems distant and God's face obscured, Elijah's journey to the brook Cherith invites us to draw close to God in quiet trust. It reminds us that even when all seems lost, our supply is not found in the world's applause, but in the faithfulness of a Creator who sees us in our hiding places and sends unexpected mercies day by day. As the story unfolds, we glimpse a God who is not only judge and king, but also gentle provider, capable of both humbling powerful rulers and feeding a solitary servant by ravens and brook. In the silence by the brook, Elijah's spirit was strengthened for what would come next. As time slipped by, the brook's gentle waters dwindled, each drop surrendering to the dry wind. Morning after morning, Elijah watched the stream shrink, and with it, the fragile security it had offered him. His heart, however, was still caught between doubt and faith. The land was brittle with thirst, and hope seemed a shadow. But often, it's in our seasons of dryness, when everything familiar and comforting disappears, that God's guidance glows brightest. Perhaps Elijah pondered how God had promised to care for him, not just by the brook, but wherever he might go. And as the final trail of water soaked into the cracked ground, the word of the Lord redirected Elijah's journey. He was commanded to travel to Zarephath, a distant village deep in the territory of Sidon. This was no ordinary town. It was enemy soil, home to worshippers of idols, far removed from the land of Israel. Yet God's direction does not always follow what makes sense to us. In the dust and loneliness, Elijah obeyed, his feet carrying him northbound over the parched land, every step declaring his trust in the unseen plans of his God. As Elijah reached the gates of Zarephath, weariness heavy on his shoulders, he encountered a widow gathering sticks, her eyes hollow from hunger. She seemed just as desolate as the landscape, her hands empty except for a few twigs, her spirit weighed down by relentless need. She was not a woman of wealth or security, but in God's mysterious wisdom, she had been appointed to sustain Elijah. "Please," Elijah asked gently, "would you bring me a little water in a jar, so I may drink?" His voice carried the humility of a man who knows his survival depends wholly on God. As she turned to fetch the water, he added, "And bring me, please, a piece of bread." The widow paused, her face pinched with sorrow. "As surely as the Lord your God lives," she replied, "I don't have any bread, only a handful of flour in a jar and a little oil in a jug. I am gathering a few sticks to take home and make a meal for myself and my son, that we may eat it and die." How Elijah's heart must have ached at her words. Yet his faith, battered but not broken, rose up. "Don't be afraid," he told her. "Go home and do as you have said. But first make a small loaf of bread for me from what you have and bring it to me. And then make something for yourself and your son. For this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says, the jar of flour will not be used up and the jug of oil will not run dry until the day the Lord sends rain on the land." Can you imagine the choice before her? Give away the last of her food to a stranger or cling tightly to what little she had? It was a crossroads of faith. Risk everything or let fear have the final word. The widow, moved by Elijah's conviction and perhaps by some quiet prompting of God's Spirit, did as Elijah had asked. And just as God had promised, the miraculous unfolded in her little kitchen. Day after day, she scooped flour from the jar and poured oil from the jug, and never once did either run out. Each morning brought fresh mercy, a sign that God sees, God provides, even when the world seems barren. What had seemed certain, a slow death by starvation, was transformed by divine sustenance in an unexpected life. Elijah, the widow, and her son found themselves gathered at a table of daily miracles, eating bread in the presence of both want and abundance. In their humble home, faith grew stronger, not because they now had plenty, but because, in their emptiness, God's faithfulness appeared. But life's trials do not always fade with one miracle. Sorrow soon pressed in, tragedy that made yesterday's hunger seem small. The widow's beloved son, her only child, fell gravely ill. With each shallow breath, despair crept closer. Soon, the boy's body grew cold and still. The room echoed with silence, his lifeless form a grim reminder that even in the midst of a miracle, suffering still visits every life. Grief burst out of the widow in a torrent of pain. She cried out to Elijah, her words thick with anguish and confusion. "What do you have against me, man of God? Did you come to remind me of my sin and kill my son?" Her grief mingled with questions about suffering and guilt, questions we all ask when hardship comes despite our trust in God. Elijah was shaken, too. Was this the end of God's provision? Was this to be the last chapter in their story? But rather than run from her pain, Elijah gathered the boy in his arms, ascending to the small upper room where he had been staying. There, in the privacy of his sorrow, he stretched himself out over the child and prayed with all his strength. He cried to the Lord, "O Lord my God, have you brought tragedy also upon this widow I am staying with by causing her son to die?" Then he pleaded, "O Lord my God, let this boy's life return to him." What followed was not mere ceremony, but desperate faith, a storm of prayer, honest, urgent, and expectant. 3 times Elijah laid himself over the child, pouring out his agony and hope. And God, whose power knows no limit, who hears the faintest cry, answered. Breath returned to the boy's lungs, his chest rose and fell, his eyes opened once more. The impossible had happened. Death had been reversed by the living power of Yahweh. Elijah carried the boy down from the upper room, back into the arms of his mother. "See," he said, "your son is alive." Wonder and gratitude sipped through the widow's soul, pushing aside fear, sorrow, and doubt. Through her tears, she confessed, "Now I know that you are a man of God, and that the word of the Lord from your mouth is the truth." In this moment, the widow's heart awakened to the living reality of Yahweh, not just a God of distant stories, but a God present and powerful, a God who cared for her and her son. Her journey from hopelessness to faith mirrors the journey we are all called to walk, surrendering our limits, our last handful of flour, our most profound sorrows into the hands of the one who gives life. The story doesn't just speak to ancient widows and weary prophets. Years of drought had gripped the land, each day a reminder of the consequences of Israel's wandering heart. The people's lips longed for water, their souls for relief, but their hearts remained turned away from God. Yet, the drought could not break their stubbornness, nor soften the hardened resolve of their king and queen who led them deeper into idolatry. But God was not finished with Israel, nor with his prophet Elijah. On a wind-swept height, Mount Carmel stood as a battleground not of swords, but of spirits and hearts. Here, Elijah, standing firm in his faith, confronted the multitude of Baal's prophets. 450 gathered in defiant pride. Around them, Israel assembled, caught in indecision, their allegiance wavering between 2 powers. Elijah's voice thundered as he posed the challenge. "How long will you waver between 2 opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him, but if Baal, then follow him." A contest was set. Each side would prepare a sacrifice, but no fire was to be set beneath it. The true God would answer by ascending fire from heaven. Baal's prophets went first. From morning until midday, they called, dancing and shouting, beating their bodies, desperate for a response from their silent idol. But there was only silence, no voice, no answer, no fire. Their cries echoed and faded into the hot, dry air. Then Elijah gathered the people close. With steady hands and a heart full of faith, he rebuilt the long-neglected altar of the Lord using 12 stones, one for each tribe of Israel. He dug a trench around it, arranged the wood, cut the sacrifice, and, as if to remove all doubt, ordered 4 jars of water poured on the offering 3 times. Water soaked the wood, the stones, even the trench filled. Every natural hope for fire was washed away. Then Elijah prayed, not with frenzy, but with calm trust. "Lord, God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel," he cried, "let it be known today that you are God in Israel, and I am your servant. Answer me, Lord, so these people will know that you, Lord, are God, and that you are turning their hearts back again." At that moment, heaven responded. Fire fell, brilliant, unstoppable, consuming the sacrifice, the wood, the stones, the dust, even the water in the trench. All who saw bowed to the ground and cried out, "The Lord, he alone is God. The Lord, he alone is God." In this moment of awe, Elijah's faith, standing solitary against the nation's doubt, was vindicated. Here, the living God made himself unmistakably known. Yet even as the people shouted, Elijah ascended Carmel again to pray. For years, there had been nothing but scorching sun and unyielding skies. Elijah bowed low, his face between his knees, and sent his servant to look toward the sea. 6 times there was nothing, but on the 7th a small cloud appeared, no larger than a man's hand. Soon the heavens blackened and rain poured down, a torrent of mercy washing away drought, prophesying hope and restoration. However, triumph was quickly followed by adversity. Jezebel, vengeful and unrepentant, threatened Elijah's life, sending him running in fear into the wilderness. Can even God's messengers become weary, discouraged, even overwhelmed? Elijah shows us they can. Under a solitary broom tree, Elijah collapsed, despairing and ready to give up, praying for God to take his life. Yet even there, God did not leave him alone. An angel touched his shoulder, urging him to rise and eat. Bread baked on hot stones and jars of water awaited him. Not just sustenance, but a sign that God saw, God cared, God provided. Strengthened, Elijah journeyed 40 days to Mount Horeb, the mountain where Moses had met God. There, Elijah hid in a cave, pouring out his loneliness and fear. I have had enough, Lord. The Israelites have rejected your covenant, torn down your altars, and put your prophets to death. I am the only one left, and now they seek my life. But God drew him out to stand on the mountain as a mighty wind toward the rocks, then an earthquake, then fire. But God was not in the wind, nor the quake, nor the fire. After these, there was only a gentle whisper, a still small voice. In that moment of quiet, God asked, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" It was not in tempest or spectacle, but in gentle intimacy that God renewed his servant. Elijah learned that his struggles did not go unseen. God spoke hope, reminding Elijah that he was not alone. 7,000 in Israel had remained faithful, though unseen by Elijah's weary eyes. God called Elijah out of hiding and into new purpose, sending him to anoint kings and to find successor. Thus, Elijah's mantle, an emblem of his prophetic calling, passed at last to Elisha, symbolizing that God's work would continue, his faithfulness unbroken from generation to generation. Elijah's journey through anguish, boldness, frailty, and fresh calling shows us that faith is not the absence of struggle, but the choice to hope against hope, even in valleys of despair. Through Elijah's story, God declares to us, in your darkest moments, when it feels as if you stand utterly alone, when everything around you seems to fail and your soul hangs in the balance, there is still a God who listens, who speaks in whispers beyond the chaos, who brings bread to the weary and rain to the parched. He reminds each of us that our lives and struggles are known. We are not forgotten, for God restores what is dry and wasted, revives the broken spirit, and calls us forward with new purpose. Elijah's courage on Mount Carmel teaches us that faith insists on trusting God when the world mocks and hope seems futile. The fire did not descend because of the prophet's eloquence, but because one person dared to stand, outnumbered, yet unashamed, for the honor of God. And when exhaustion overtook even him, God's tenderness prevailed, proving that he does not discard his servants in weakness, but meets them there, strengthens them silently, and gives them strength to go on. Passing his cloak to Elisha, Elijah gave testimony that God's promise passes from hand to hand, heart to heart. Faith's story is never extinguished, but continues as long as there are those willing to listen, trust, and obey. Through the rain that broke the drought, the sacrifice consumed by fire, the quiet whisper on Horeb, God's voice calls still, choose whom you will serve. Stand firm in seasons of drought, hold fast in moments of despair, and pass the mantle onward. As you step into your day, remember Elijah's courage. Let your faith ignite hope, knowing God's power still guides, uplifts, and transforms you. If this story spoke to your heart, share it with someone who needs hope today. And remember, God still speaks, even in the silence. Subscribe now for more biblical wisdom and cinematic journeys of faith.